He went into the forest when relatives, neighbors, and strangers laughed at him, and started building a house from abandoned pallets that everyone considered nothing but trash. No one believed the house would last even a month, but what he built in the end left everyone speechless. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. Before the forest, before the pallets, before the silence that would later become his refuge, the man's life unfolded in places that never truly belonged to him. His mornings began in rooms that carried the lingering presence of other people's decisions. The walls were thin, the floors creaked with unfamiliar memories, and the air always felt borrowed. Every object he owned fit into a few bags, not because he preferred simplicity, but because permanence had never been offered to him. Each day followed a rhythm shaped by necessity rather than choice. Temporary work, short contracts, unstable schedules, and long commutes stitched together a life that never settled long enough to feel solid. He moved through the city like someone constantly passing through, even after years of staying in the same places. Apartments changed, neighborhoods shifted, faces blurred, but the underlying pattern remained unchanged. Rent rose faster than his income. Promises of stability evaporated into polite rejections. Applications disappeared into silence. Offices smiled during interviews and closed their doors afterward. Every attempt to secure something lasting ended the same way, with an unspoken message that he was acceptable only in fragments, never as a whole person worthy of trust. He was not careless with money, nor irresponsible with time. He worked harder than most, often taking on physically demanding jobs that left his hands raw and his body aching. Yet, effort alone never translated into progress. Each step forward seemed to trigger an invisible force that pushed him back into the same narrow margins. He noticed how conversations changed when people learned where he lived or what he did. The tone softened, the expectations lowered, and assumptions quietly settled around him like dust. He became accustomed to being seen as someone who would always manage, but never truly succeed. Family gatherings amplified this sense of invisibility. There, his life was measured against others with ruthless efficiency. Success was defined narrowly and without mercy. Ownership, stability, status, and visible comfort were the only currencies that mattered. His choices were framed as mistakes, his persistence interpreted as stubbornness, his refusal to settle for less treated as foolish pride. Advice came disguised as concern, but it carried the weight of judgment. He listened, nodded, and absorbed it all without protest, not because he agreed, but because resistance only reinforced their certainty that he was lost. Neighbors and acquaintances mirrored the same quiet dismissal. Smiles were polite, curiosity shallow, respect conditional. He felt it when landlords hesitated, when contracts ended without explanation, when people spoke around him rather than to him. There was always an unspoken ceiling above his head, one he was never invited to challenge. Over time, this constant pressure reshaped the way he moved through the world. He learned to keep his expectations low, his plans vague, and his dreams carefully hidden. The breaking point did not arrive as a dramatic explosion, but as a slow accumulation of small humiliations. Another rejection, another reminder that his efforts were not enough, another moment where his worth was quietly questioned. One evening, standing in a borrowed room surrounded by borrowed space, he understood with startling clarity that nothing would change if he continued asking permission to exist. The system he was navigating had no place prepared for him beyond survival. Everything else would require a different path entirely. That realization forced him inward. He began to examine what he truly wanted, stripped of what others expected or approved of. He did not crave luxury or recognition. He did not dream of excess or validation. What he wanted was something far more basic and far more radical. He wanted control over his own space. He wanted to wake up without fear of eviction, without the weight of judgment pressing against the walls. He wanted silence, stability, and the dignity of building something that could not be taken away because someone decided he no longer qualified to stay. The idea of a home had always seemed distant, reserved for those with resources and approval. Yet, as he walked through industrial districts and back alleys, he noticed something that others ignored. Wooden pallets stacked behind warehouses, discarded without a second thought. Thousands of them, weathered but intact, treated as waste simply because they no longer served their original purpose. To most people, they were obstacles or debris. To him, they began to resemble opportunity. He studied them closely, noticing their structure, their strength, the way they bore heavy loads every day without complaint. He researched quietly, observing how wood behaved over time, how it could be reinforced, protected, repurposed. He read, watched, learned, and tested small ideas in his mind. The more he understood, the clearer it became that these discarded objects were not symbols of failure, but of resilience. They had carried weight, endured pressure, and been abandoned not because they were broken, but because they were no longer convenient. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Like the pallets, he too had been useful, reliable, and persistent, yet easily dismissed once his presence no longer fit a preferred image. That realization transformed the idea from curiosity into purpose. Building with pallets was not about saving money alone. It was about reclaiming value from what the world chose to discard. It was about proving, first to himself, that worth did not depend on permission. He did not announce his plan. There was no dramatic declaration, no attempt to convince anyone. He understood that explaining would only invite laughter and resistance. Instead, he prepared quietly. He gathered tools, planned routes, mapped out places where pallets were thrown away. He calculated what he could carry, what he could store, and how long it might take. Each step brought him closer to a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The forest entered his thoughts not as an escape from society, but as a boundary where its rules weakened. He searched for a place far enough to offer solitude, yet accessible enough to survive. He studied terrain, water flow, sunlight, and shelter. This was not a romantic retreat. It was a calculated move toward independence. The forest did not promise comfort, but it offered honesty. There, failure would be his alone, not imposed by someone else's expectations. When he finally left the city, he did so quietly. No farewell, no explanation, no dramatic gesture. He took only what he needed and what he trusted. The absence of noise felt unsettling at first. Without constant judgment and distraction, he was forced to confront himself fully. The silence magnified every doubt and every hope. Yet, with each passing day, it also began to loosen the grip of the voices that had followed him for so long. Word spread quickly, distorted by ridicule. People spoke of a man building a house out of trash deep in the woods. The story became a joke before it became a fact. Photos circulated, taken from a distance, framed to exaggerate the mess and minimize the intention. Laughter followed, fueled by the comfort of feeling superior. Relatives shook their heads, neighbors smirked, strangers commented without context. The narrative was simple and cruel. He had finally lost his mind. He heard about it, of course. News travels faster than effort. But by then, something inside him had shifted. The laughter no longer defined him. It became background noise, distant and powerless. Each pallet he carried into the forest felt like a quiet rebuttal. Each decision made without asking approval strengthened his resolve. He accepted the mockery as part of the cost, understanding that freedom rarely arrives without misunderstanding. As the forest slowly began to fill with stacked wood and deliberate order replaced chaos, the first chapter of his transformation settled into place. The man who once waited for permission was gone. In his place stood someone willing to endure isolation, judgment, and uncertainty for the chance to build a life on his own terms. The laughter continued, but it no longer reached him the same way. Ahead lay exhaustion, failure, and hardship, but also something he had never truly possessed before: the possibility of a future shaped by his own hands. The silence of the forest did not erase the weight of the city all at once. It lingered in his movements, in the way he paused before every decision, still half expecting someone to interrupt, correct, or judge him. But work has a way of reshaping thought. As soon as the first pallets were stacked near his chosen clearing, his mind shifted from reflection to execution. The idea was no longer abstract. It demanded discipline, structure, and endurance. If the first chapter of his escape had been emotional, this one was relentlessly practical. He approached the collection of pallets with the seriousness of a logistical operation rather than scavenging. Every trip back toward industrial zones and warehouses was planned with care. He learned which places replaced their pallets weekly, which stores left them exposed to rain, and which discarded them in bulk after deliveries. Timing mattered. Arriving too early meant suspicion. Arriving too late meant finding only splintered remains. He began to understand the rhythms of supply chains better than many who worked within them. Not all pallets were equal, and that lesson came quickly. Some were soaked through, their fibers swollen and weakened. Others carried invisible damage from years of heavy loads. He examined each one closely, learning to read the wood through touch and sound. A dull thud meant weakness. A sharp knock suggested strength. He learned to smell mold before he could see it, and to recognize stress fractures hidden beneath surface grime. What others dismissed as junk became a language he slowly mastered. Transportation posed its own challenges. Each pallet was heavy, awkward, and uncooperative. He carried them alone, sometimes dragging them across uneven ground, sometimes balancing them on makeshift supports. The physical strain was constant, but it carried a strange satisfaction. Pain now translated directly into progress. Every trip added visible mass to his growing stockpile. The forest, once empty, began to change shape around his efforts. At the edge of the clearing, he organized the pallets into deliberate stacks. Those destined for walls were separated from those meant to be dismantled. The straightest ones were reserved for structural elements. Damaged pieces were stripped down into usable boards. This order was not aesthetic. It was survival. Confusion wasted energy, and wasted energy could become dangerous when working alone, far from help. Alongside the growing stacks of wood, he built a temporary camp. It was crude but functional, designed to protect him rather than impress. A simple shelter shielded him from rain and wind. A small, controlled heat source provided warmth without risk. Tools were arranged with care, repaired when possible, replaced only when absolutely necessary. Each object earned its place through usefulness alone. Living this close to the land forced him to reconsider habits he had once taken for granted. Water had to be collected and stored thoughtfully. Food had to be planned to avoid waste and spoilage. Clothing needed to dry quickly and protect against injury. Nights brought unfamiliar sounds, reminders that the forest operated by rules older and less forgiving than those of the city. He learned to move carefully, to listen before acting, to respect boundaries that could not be negotiated. Safety became a constant calculation. A single mistake could mean injury with no immediate help. He adjusted his pace, refusing to rush despite the pressure of time and weather. Each cut, each lift, each step was deliberate. This caution did not slow him as much as it refined him. The work became steady, almost meditative, and through it his confidence grew. Preparing the site itself demanded patience. The ground was uneven, shaped by roots, stones, and years of natural erosion. Rather than forcing it into submission, he worked with it. He cleared only what was necessary, preserving trees that offered wind protection and shade. He studied how water moved through the area after rain, marking where it pooled and where it drained naturally. These observations guided his decisions more than any blueprint could. The foundation presented one of his earliest true tests. Without access to traditional materials or machinery, he had to invent a solution from what he could find and carry. Stones were gathered and positioned carefully. Supports were leveled by hand, checked repeatedly, adjusted again and again. This was slow work, frustrating at times, but essential. A weak base would doom everything that followed. As the outline of the future structure took shape, he began to imagine how space would function rather than how it would look. He thought about heat flow, movement, storage, and light. Where would warmth collect in winter? Where would moisture threaten the wood? How would he move through the space during long, cold nights? These considerations transformed the project from a shelter into a home, even before walls existed. Meanwhile, the world he had left behind continued to react. Stories spread, often exaggerated, sometimes malicious. People ventured into the forest out of curiosity or ridicule. Some took photos, framing them to emphasize disorder. Others left traces of their presence, disturbed stacks, missing tools, careless footprints. These intrusions reminded him that isolation was never complete, and that his project existed under constant scrutiny, even if he refused to acknowledge it. Rather than confronting these disruptions, he adapted. Valuable items were hidden. Paths were altered. His routine became less predictable. He learned to protect his work quietly, without escalation. This restraint was not weakness. It was focus. Conflict would consume energy he could not afford to lose. As weeks turned into months, the scale of the project became impossible to ignore. The volume of pallets alone suggested ambition far beyond a simple hut. Lines were drawn in the dirt, marking future boundaries. Sections were measured and remeasured. The clearing began to resemble a construction site rather than a campsite. Anyone who truly looked could see intention forming beneath the rough exterior. He felt the weight of expectation, both external and internal. Failure was no longer a personal disappointment. It had become a spectacle others waited for. Yet this awareness did not paralyze him. Instead, it sharpened his resolve. He understood that progress would not silence laughter immediately. Only endurance would. By the end of this phase, his hands bore the marks of labor, and his body carried the fatigue of sustained effort. But his mind had changed more profoundly than his surroundings. The man who once reacted to circumstances was now shaping them. Each pallet placed, each tool repaired, each decision made without permission reinforced a new identity. The forest no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a workshop, a proving ground where intention met resistance daily. Ahead lay the real test. Building upward would expose every weakness, every miscalculation. The structure would soon stand tall enough to attract not just laughter, but judgment sharpened by anticipation. And when the first walls rose, the project would face its earliest and most painful failures. By the time the first walls began to rise, the forest had already learned his presence. Paths had formed where his boots passed daily. The clearing bore the marks of intention rather than accident. Stacks of pallets stood like silent witnesses to weeks of preparation, and the ground beneath them carried the imprint of careful planning. What had begun as an idea now demanded proof. The moment for theory had passed. Wood had to stand against gravity, weather, and doubt. The earliest sections of the frame came together slowly and awkwardly. From a distance, the structure looked ungainly, almost embarrassing. The pallets varied in color and texture, some darker from age, others pale and rough, creating a patchwork that invited ridicule. The lines were imperfect. The angles resisted symmetry. Temporary supports leaned at odd directions, holding up sections that seemed uncertain of their own purpose. Anyone stumbling upon the site at this stage would have seen only chaos disguised as effort. He saw something else entirely. He understood that the first form of anything honest is rarely beautiful. The early shape of the house was not meant to impress, but to endure. Each pallet was positioned with intention, reinforced where weakness revealed itself, adjusted when alignment drifted. He moved slowly, often stepping back to observe, then returning to correct small deviations before they multiplied into fatal flaws. The physical difficulty increased immediately. Lifting pallets alone required careful leverage and patience. One wrong move could twist a joint or send the entire section crashing down. He devised simple systems of ropes and supports, learning to use his body efficiently rather than forcefully. Every success was earned inch by inch, and every error carried immediate consequences. As the walls climbed higher, new problems emerged. The combined weight of the pallets stressed the foundation in ways he had only partially anticipated. Small shifts in the ground translated into visible lean above. He corrected constantly, bracing, redistributing load, reinforcing joints. The structure resisted his attempts to impose order, reminding him that material has memory and limits. Fasteners became a constant concern. Cheap nails bent or loosened under pressure. Screws stripped or snapped. Each failure forced him to reconsider how pieces connected, how stress traveled through the frame. He began thinking less like a scavenger and more like a builder, tracing imaginary lines of force through wood and joint, imagining how wind and weight would interact long before they arrived. Angles proved particularly unforgiving. Corners that appeared solid at first revealed subtle weaknesses as the structure expanded. He tore down and rebuilt sections repeatedly, each time learning something new. Frustration followed him closely, but it no longer controlled him. Every correction felt like progress, even when it erased hours of work. The first serious confrontation with weather arrived without warning. Rain fell steadily for hours, turning the ground soft and unstable. Water pooled where he had misjudged drainage, seeping beneath supports and weakening their grip. As wind joined the rain, the incomplete walls began to shift. The sound of stressed wood echoed through the clearing, a warning he could not ignore. That night, part of the structure failed. A section he believed secure gave way under combined pressure, collapsing with sudden violence. The noise cut through the forest, followed by silence heavier than the impact itself. He stood alone, soaked and exhausted, staring at the wreckage. Broken pallets lay scattered, their promise temporarily undone. It was a moment everyone had predicted, the proof others waited for. The emotional weight of that failure pressed harder than the physical loss. He felt the familiar echo of voices that had doubted him from the beginning. The laughter, the dismissive comments, the certainty that he would fail. In that moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether he would finally accept their judgment. He did not leave. Instead, he worked through the night, not rebuilding, but dismantling what remained unstable. He separated salvageable pieces from those too damaged to trust. He cleaned the site, restoring order from chaos. There was no dramatic defiance in his actions, only quiet determination. The collapse had not ended the project. It had clarified it. When dawn arrived, he examined the foundation with new eyes. Weaknesses revealed themselves plainly now. Supports needed reinforcement. Weight distribution required adjustment. The structure demanded respect rather than optimism. He accepted this without bitterness. Failure, he realized, was not an enemy but a teacher that spoke harshly and honestly. Reconstruction began with humility. He lowered sections rather than raising them, strengthening before expanding. Diagonal bracing appeared where none existed before. Joints were doubled, connections layered. He experimented cautiously, testing each addition before trusting it. Progress slowed, but stability increased. Protecting the wood became a priority. Moisture threatened not just comfort, but survival. He altered storage methods, ensuring pallets dried properly before use. He treated surfaces as best he could, improvising solutions to extend their life. These adjustments reflected a deeper change in approach. The house was no longer an experiment. It was a responsibility. Despite the setback, word spread quickly. Those who had predicted failure felt validated, at least temporarily. Photos of the collapse circulated, framed as the inevitable conclusion to a foolish dream. The attention sharpened, more focused, more confident in its cruelty. Yet none of it reached him in the same way anymore. He had already faced the worst moment alone in the forest, and it had not destroyed him. As the structure rose again, it did so with greater purpose. The lines straightened, the frame stiffened. What had once seemed fragile now resisted movement. He tested it deliberately, applying pressure, observing response. Confidence returned, not as hope, but as evidence. By the end of this phase, the house stood once more, stronger than before. It remained rough and unfinished, but its presence felt different. It no longer looked like a pile of discarded wood fighting gravity. It looked like something learning how to stand. Those who expected abandonment saw only silence from the forest. No announcement of defeat arrived. No explanation followed. The man continued working, patient and unyielding. He had crossed an invisible threshold. Failure no longer threatened his resolve. It refined it. What lay ahead would be harder. Height would invite wind. Weather would test every assumption, and endurance would demand more than strength alone. But the first true failure had come and gone, and he was still there, building not just a house, but a version of himself that could not be so easily undone. After the collapse and the quiet rebuilding that followed, the forest entered a different phase of silence. It was no longer the silence of anticipation or ridicule, but the silence of endurance. The structure stood again, more grounded, more deliberate, yet far from complete. Its presence marked a boundary between what had already been overcome and what still waited ahead. This was the stage no one spoke about, the stretch where enthusiasm vanished and only persistence remained. The physical toll began to accumulate in ways he could not ignore. His hands bore deep cuts and hardened calluses that never fully healed before being reopened. His shoulders ached constantly, stiff in the mornings, slow to warm. Each movement carried the memory of strain. He learned to work through pain not by denying it, but by acknowledging it and adjusting. He took longer breaks, moved more carefully, and listened to the limits of his body, understanding that recklessness would end everything he had built. Nights grew colder, and the temporary shelter offered only partial protection. Wind found its way through seams, rain drummed endlessly on makeshift coverings, and dampness crept into his clothes and bones. Sleep came in fragments. He woke often, checking the structure instinctively, listening for unfamiliar sounds. In those moments of half-consciousness, doubts surfaced with renewed intensity. Without distraction, the mind wandered freely, revisiting every insult, every warning, every prediction of failure. Psychological pressure pressed as heavily as physical exhaustion. The voices of those who laughed lingered in his thoughts, not as words, but as assumptions. He imagined their satisfaction if they could see him now, cold, sore, and isolated. The temptation to walk away appeared unexpectedly, not as a dramatic surrender, but as a quiet suggestion that no one would blame him for stopping. That suggestion was more dangerous than open ridicule because it felt reasonable. What kept him from leaving was not pride or anger, but the clarity of his original intention. He did not come to the forest to impress anyone. He came to reclaim control over his life. Abandoning the project would not simply end a construction effort, it would confirm the belief that he could only survive, never build. That realization anchored him during the worst moments. Resources dwindled steadily. Fasteners ran low. Protective materials were scarce. Tools wore down and broke. Each loss forced him to adapt. He learned to salvage metal from discarded objects, to straighten bent nails, to reuse materials others would throw away without hesitation. Old windows became light sources. Damaged doors transformed into structural panels. Pieces of scrap metal reinforced joints vulnerable to stress. Nothing was wasted without careful consideration. These improvised solutions revealed his growing ingenuity. What began as necessity evolved into a philosophy of use. He stopped seeing materials as limited by their original purpose. Instead, he saw potential shaped by imagination and understanding. This shift extended beyond construction. It reshaped how he viewed himself. He was no longer defined by what he lacked, but by how he adapted. Living in the forest changed his relationship with nature in subtle but profound ways. He learned the patterns of animals that passed nearby, recognizing which sounds signaled danger and which meant nothing at all. He adjusted his work schedule around weather rather than resisting it. Rain days became preparation days. Clear mornings were reserved for the heaviest labor. The forest ceased to be a backdrop and became a partner that demanded respect. As the structure slowly expanded, its purpose became clearer. The layout hinted at something more thoughtful than a simple shelter. Zones emerged within the frame, spaces designated for rest, warmth, storage, and work. The house began to reflect intention rather than survival. Each decision reinforced the sense that this was not a temporary experiment, but a long-term commitment. During this period, the deeper motivation behind the project surfaced fully. He was not building only for himself. The house represented proof that dignity did not require approval or wealth. It stood as a challenge to the assumptions that had followed him his entire life. Though he had not articulated this goal aloud, it shaped every choice he made. Isolation intensified. Fewer people visited the site now, either bored or convinced the outcome was already decided. This absence was both a relief and a test. Without external attention, the only validation available came from progress itself. Each completed section, each problem solved, provided quiet satisfaction. He learned to rely on that feeling alone. Yet, isolation also magnified vulnerability. A single injury could become catastrophic. He planned meticulously, preparing contingencies, ensuring he could reach help if necessary. This caution extended his timeline but preserved his future. The dream demanded patience, not speed. Gradually, signs of transformation became visible. The structure no longer appeared fragile. Reinforced walls resisted movement. Openings for windows suggested warmth and light. The space inside felt contained, intentional. Those few who passed by no longer laughed openly. Some paused longer, curiosity replacing mockery. Cameras appeared less frequently, and when they did, the tone shifted subtly. He noticed these changes without celebrating them. Validation from others arrived too late to matter. His focus remained fixed on completion. Each day he added small improvements, refining details invisible to casual observers, but essential to longevity. The house was becoming something that could endure seasons, not just moments. This stage demanded more from him than any before. It stripped away illusion and left only effort. The cost was high, paid in exhaustion, loneliness, and uncertainty. Yet it was also the period where his resolve solidified permanently. He no longer questioned whether he belonged in this endeavor. He was fully committed, regardless of outcome. By the time the hardest weeks passed, he stood within the partially enclosed structure and felt a shift that words could not capture. The space held warmth differently. Sound behaved differently. The forest seemed slightly farther away. For the first time, the house offered not just shelter, but presence. It acknowledged him as its builder. The worst was not over, but the foundation of both the house and the man had been tested and proven. What remained was refinement, exposure to true forces, and the moment when endurance would face its ultimate challenge. By the time the hardest period loosened its grip, the forest no longer felt like a place that merely tolerated the structure. It felt altered by it. The house had reached a point where it could no longer be dismissed as a temporary shelter or an unfinished experiment. Its silhouette stood clearly among the trees, distinct enough to interrupt the familiar lines of branches and sky. The man sensed this change before anyone else did, not through pride, but through a quiet awareness that the project had crossed a boundary few expected it to reach. The work now shifted upward and inward at the same time. Strength was no longer limited to the ground and walls. He began reinforcing the upper sections, carefully constructing a second level that demanded precision far beyond anything he had attempted before. Each addition multiplied the risk as height invited instability and magnified errors. He approached this phase slowly, almost cautiously, understanding that haste could undo everything achieved so far. The structure responded differently now. Where it once creaked and protested at every new load, it began to accept weight with restrained confidence. The reinforced joints held. The diagonal bracing performed its silent duty. When he stepped back and applied pressure, the frame resisted rather than shifted. This resistance carried meaning. It was the language of endurance, spoken through wood and tension rather than words. As the second level took shape, the interior transformed dramatically. Light began to filter through planned openings instead of accidental gaps. The play of sunlight inside the structure softened the roughness of the materials. Shadows moved slowly across walls that no longer felt provisional. The space gained depth, dividing itself naturally into areas that suggested purpose and order. What once felt like an exposed work site now hinted at shelter. Windows marked a turning point. Salvaged from discarded buildings and forgotten storage, each one carried traces of its past life. He installed them with care, sealing and reinforcing their frames to withstand weather and time. When the first window was set properly, the interior changed instantly. Air moved differently, sound softened. The house began to breathe. Insulation followed, layer by layer, applied with patience and improvisation. He worked with what he could find, combining materials to trap warmth without sealing moisture inside. Every decision balanced comfort with longevity. He tested airflow, adjusted gaps, and refined coverage until the space held heat more reliably. These details, invisible from the outside, define the difference between survival and living. The threat of water remained constant. Rain tested the roof repeatedly, exposing weak points he addressed without delay. He improved drainage, added protective layers, and redirected runoff away from the foundation. Each storm served as an examination rather than an obstacle. When the structure held, he noted its success quietly and moved on to the next improvement. Autonomy began to emerge gradually. He constructed a system to collect rainwater, filtering it through layers of repurposed materials until it was safe for use. Storage containers appeared, positioned carefully to maintain balance and accessibility. He introduced a heating solution designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing risk. Warmth became predictable rather than occasional. These developments changed the tone of the project entirely. The house no longer appeared fragile or desperate. It radiated intention. Its lines, though unconventional, felt deliberate. Anyone encountering it now paused longer, uncertain how to categorize what they were seeing. It defied easy labels. It was not traditional, yet it was not crude. It was not expensive, yet it was not cheap. The reaction from the outside world shifted accordingly. Visitors still arrived, but their behavior had changed. Laughter faded into silence. Phones remained lowered longer before recording. Some walked slowly around the structure, observing rather than mocking. Conversations quieted in its presence. The forest no longer echoed with ridicule, but with curiosity edged by disbelief. The man noticed these changes without seeking them. He did not greet visitors or explain his methods. He continued working as though unseen, focused on refining rather than defending his choices. Attention, once painful, now felt irrelevant. His relationship with the project had matured beyond external validation. Inside the house, the atmosphere grew calmer. Sounds from the forest softened, filtered through layered walls. Wind no longer whistled freely through cracks. Rain transformed from threat to background rhythm. For the first time, he experienced moments of stillness within a space shaped entirely by his own hands. This stillness brought clarity. He recognized how far the project had come, not in distance measured by time, but by transformation. What began as defiance had evolved into creation. What started as resistance had become mastery. The house reflected his internal journey as clearly as his external one. He remained cautious. Success, he knew, could invite complacency. He continued to test assumptions, reinforce weak points, and prepare for conditions yet to come. Winter loomed as a final judge, one that would expose every shortcut and oversight. He worked with that awareness constantly, refusing to celebrate prematurely. Yet, even with restraint, a quiet certainty settled in. The house had reached a stage where its existence alone challenged expectations. It stood as evidence that effort, patience, and adaptation could overcome scarcity and doubt. Those who once dismissed the project now struggled to reconcile their assumptions with reality. As the structure neared completion, the forest seemed to accommodate it naturally. The house did not dominate its surroundings. It integrated into them, reflecting light and shadow in ways that felt balanced rather than intrusive. It belonged, not because it conformed, but because it respected the space it occupied. The man continued working with steady resolve, aware that the most demanding test still awaited him. Weather would soon assert its authority fully. The house would face forces beyond human control. And in that confrontation, the project would either fail decisively or confirm what few dared to believe. For now, the impossible had already begun to look real. The shift from construction to confrontation happened quietly, almost politely, as autumn withdrew and the forest prepared itself for something harsher. The house stood nearly complete, solid in appearance and confident in posture, but nature had not yet delivered its verdict. What had been tested so far were assumptions, calculations, and endurance. What remained was the true examination, the one no human planning could fully anticipate. The season changed not with ceremony but with pressure. Cold arrived first, subtle and patient. Mornings grew sharper, breath visible in the air before the sun fully rose. Wood responded immediately, contracting and tightening, revealing faint sounds within the walls as materials adjusted to new conditions. The man listened closely, attentive to every creak and shift, interpreting them not as threats, but as information. Each sound told a story of stress, of balance, of where strength held and where it needed reinforcement. Wind followed, probing the structure with methodical persistence. It moved through the trees in waves, testing the house from multiple directions, seeking weaknesses the way water finds cracks. The walls resisted, absorbing force rather than deflecting it entirely. He observed how pressure traveled across surfaces, how certain corners bore more strain than others. He responded not with panic, but with calculated adjustments, adding support where necessary, tightening joints that revealed the slightest hesitation. The first heavy storm arrived without warning. Rain fell relentlessly, driven sideways by wind that stripped leaves from branches and sent them spinning across the clearing. Water poured from the sky with intent, challenging every seal and slope he had designed. Inside the house, he remained still, listening. Drops struck the roof in rapid succession, their rhythm accelerating until individual impacts blurred into a continuous roar. Leaks appeared where he least expected them. Thin lines of moisture traced paths along beams and down walls, marking vulnerabilities invisible in calm weather. He moved quickly, addressing each one methodically, redirecting flow, reinforcing barriers, sealing gaps. The house responded, adjusting as he did, learning alongside him. When the storm passed, the structure remained intact, damp but standing, its failures exposed but manageable. Snow arrived soon after, transforming the forest into something quieter and heavier. The weight settled onto the roof slowly at first, then with accumulating certainty. He monitored the load carefully, removing buildup when necessary, observing how the frame responded. The roof bowed slightly, then held, distributing pressure exactly as intended. It was not rigid, it was resilient. One night brought the most dangerous test yet. Wind intensified unexpectedly, rising to a level that forced even the trees to protest audibly. Branches cracked in the distance. The forest groaned under the strain. The house stood in the clearing, exposed, its silhouette stark against the movement around it. Inside, the man remained awake, prepared to leave if necessary, yet unwilling to abandon what he had built unless survival demanded it. During the height of the storm, a tree fell nearby, crashing into the ground with explosive force. The impact sent vibrations through the earth and air alike. For a moment, he believed the structure might not endure the shock. He braced himself, both physically and mentally, ready to accept whatever outcome followed. But the house absorbed the disturbance, settling rather than collapsing. The walls shuddered, then stilled. In the aftermath, he discovered areas that required immediate attention. Certain joints had loosened. Some supports needed reinforcement. These were not failures, but messages delivered under extreme conditions. He addressed them without delay, working through cold and exhaustion, driven by the understanding that this was the moment that defined the project's future. The true significance of this trial extended beyond engineering. It represented the culmination of every doubt others had voiced. Those who waited for collapse believed this storm would provide it. They expected photos of wreckage, stories of defeat, confirmation of their assumptions. None came. Instead, the house endured, scarred, adjusted, strengthened, but standing. The elements had tested not only wood and structure but resolve. And in that confrontation, both had proven capable. As the worst of the season passed, subtle changes occurred beyond the forest. Stories shifted tone, curiosity replaced certainty. People spoke less confidently about inevitable failure. The silence that followed carried weight. It was not admiration yet, but it was no longer mockery. Inside the house, warmth became consistent. Light reflected differently off snow-covered ground, filling the interior with a muted brightness. The man allowed himself no celebration, but he acknowledged the truth privately. The house had crossed the threshold from possibility to reality. What remained now was not survival, but recognition. Not from others necessarily, but from the project itself. The structure had revealed its character, and in doing so, reflected his own. The world had waited for collapse. What it received instead was proof. The forest, once a place of isolation, now held something unmistakable. A house that had faced the elements and remained. And a man who had done the same. After the storms passed and the forest settled into a quieter rhythm, the house remained, altered but unbroken. Snow lingered in shaded places. Water traced new but controlled paths around the foundation, and the structure bore subtle marks of its trial. These marks did not weaken it, they clarified it. The house now looked lived in, tested, proven. It no longer resembled an experiment waiting for judgment. It stood as a fact. The first video appeared online almost by accident. Someone who had followed the story casually returned to the clearing expecting to document damage, perhaps ruins. Instead, they found the house intact, solid, and unmistakably functional. The footage was unpolished and quiet, capturing long, steady shots rather than sensational angles. There was no commentary, no mockery, only disbelief lingering in the way the camera moved. That absence of ridicule spoke louder than any laughter had before. The video spread quickly, not because it was dramatic, but because it contradicted a narrative many had accepted without question. People shared it with brief captions that carried confusion rather than certainty. The house did not fit the ending they had predicted. It resisted simple interpretation, and that resistance drew attention. Soon, others arrived. Some came with professional curiosity, others with skepticism masked as interest. Journalists followed, then individuals with technical backgrounds who wanted to understand how a structure built from discarded materials had endured what many conventional homes struggled against. They walked the perimeter slowly, examining joints, testing stability, observing details that revealed careful thought rather than luck. The man did not guide them. He did not explain unless asked, and even then his responses remained minimal and practical. He described what worked, what failed, and what he changed. There was no attempt to impress, no effort to reclaim dignity through recognition. The house spoke more convincingly than he ever could. As scrutiny deepened, the first shock emerged. The structure was not merely standing, it was intelligently designed. Load distribution followed clear logic. Reinforcements were placed where stress demanded them. The materials, though unconventional, were used with discipline and restraint. The house was not accidental. It was intentional. The second shock followed quickly and struck harder. The house was autonomous. Water collection systems functioned reliably. Heat retention exceeded expectations. Energy use was minimal and efficient. This was not a survival shelter clinging to existence. It was a sustainable living space capable of long-term use. The third realization unsettled many observers more than the engineering ever could. The man who built it was not an eccentric dreamer acting on impulse. His methods reflected patience, study, and foresight. He had not stumbled into success. He had worked deliberately toward it, step by step, absorbing failure without surrender. The image others had constructed of him began to collapse under the weight of evidence. Relatives arrived eventually, drawn by stories they could no longer dismiss. Their reactions were quiet and restrained, shaped by discomfort rather than pride. They recognized the house immediately, not as a novelty, but as a challenge to the assumptions they had voiced so confidently. No apologies were spoken, yet none were needed. The silence carried its own acknowledgement. Neighbors who once laughed now avoided eye contact. Some approached cautiously, curiosity overriding embarrassment. They asked questions about cost, time, and materials, searching for a way to reconcile the outcome with their worldview. The answers unsettled them. The house had not required wealth. It had required resolve. As attention intensified, the deeper purpose of the project surfaced. The house was never meant to be a private triumph hidden in the woods. It was a demonstration, a prototype, proof that dignity and stability could be constructed without permission, without capital, without validation from institutions that had long denied access to people like him. This realization reframed the entire story. The house was no longer about one man escaping judgment. It was about exposing the fragility of that judgment itself. It revealed how easily society dismissed potential when it did not arrive wrapped in familiar forms. Experts debated the implications. Some praised the innovation. Others attempted to downplay it as impractical on a larger scale. Yet, even skepticism carried a different tone now. It acknowledged substance rather than absurdity. The conversation had shifted permanently. The man observed all of this from a distance, emotionally removed from the reactions swirling around him. He did not feel vindicated. He felt confirmed. The outcome mattered less than the process that led to it. The house had fulfilled its purpose regardless of how others interpreted it. What surprised him most was not the recognition, but the quiet way it arrived. There was no triumphant moment, no dramatic reversal of fortune. Instead, there was a gradual recalibration of perception. People spoke more carefully. Assumptions softened. Certainty dissolved. The laughter that once defined the project vanished completely. In its place stood a silence heavier than mockery ever was. That silence marked the collapse of certainty, the uncomfortable space where people were forced to confront their own limitations of imagination. The forest remained unchanged, indifferent to the shift in human opinion. Trees stood as they always had. Wind moved through branches without regard for recognition or shame. Within that steady environment, the house stood as something quietly radical. The man understood then that the greatest shock was not the house itself, but what it revealed about those who doubted it. They had not failed to believe in wood and structure. They had failed to believe in him, and in doing so, they had revealed the narrowness of their own vision. This chapter of the journey did not end with applause or acclaim. It ended with understanding. Understanding that the house had done what words never could. It had forced people to see value where they had only seen waste, and capability where they had assumed limitation. The final phase would not be about proving anything further. It would be about choosing what to do with the truth now standing quietly in the forest, undeniable and unyielding. When the wave of attention receded, what remained was quieter and more important than recognition. The forest returned to its familiar rhythm as if the interruption had never occurred. Visitors became rare again. The clearing belonged once more to wind, birds, and the slow movement of light across wood and earth. The house stood unchanged, neither elevated by praise nor diminished by the absence of it. It existed on its own terms, exactly as it was meant to. The man returned fully to himself in that quiet. For the first time since leaving the city, he was not reacting to expectation, doubt, or curiosity. He was simply living inside a space he had shaped completely. Each morning unfolded without urgency. The sounds inside the house were familiar and reassuring. The walls held warmth steadily. The floor carried his weight without protest. The roof no longer demanded constant attention. The structure had crossed the threshold from project to home. He finished the last details without ceremony. Small adjustments, refinements that only he would ever notice. He reinforced storage spaces, improved airflow in subtle ways, and organized the interior so that every object had a clear purpose. There was no rush to declare completion. He understood that a house, like a person, is never truly finished. It evolves through care rather than construction. Standing outside one evening, he looked at the house as the light faded behind the trees. It did not dominate the clearing. It did not announce itself. It blended into the forest with a quiet confidence, reflecting the balance he had sought from the beginning. The structure felt neither improvised nor forced. It belonged there, as if it had always waited to be built. The question of what came next emerged slowly. Offers arrived, some subtle, others direct. People suggested monetizing the idea, turning the house into a spectacle or a commodity. Others spoke of partnerships, exposure, expansion. He listened without committing. These opportunities carried a familiar tone, one that felt dangerously close to the systems he had walked away from. He chose restraint instead. The house had never been about profit or validation. It was proof of concept, not a product. He understood that selling the idea too cheaply would strip it of meaning. What mattered was not replication at scale, but the possibility it represented. Gradually, he began sharing knowledge on his own terms, quietly, without fanfare. He documented methods, materials, failures, and solutions. He focused on clarity rather than persuasion. The information was not framed as inspiration or rebellion, but as instruction. It carried no promise beyond honesty. People who found this work were often those who needed it most. Individuals pushed to the margins by circumstance rather than choice. Those who lacked access but not ability. He did not present himself as a savior or leader. He remained a builder sharing what he had learned, nothing more. Relatives and neighbors adjusted slowly. Some attempted reconciliation through casual conversation. Others maintained distance, unsure how to approach a reality that contradicted their earlier certainty. He accepted both responses without resentment. Understanding did not require agreement, only acknowledgement. What surprised him most was the absence of bitterness within himself. He did not feel the need to remind anyone of their doubt. The house had already done that work. Its existence rendered old judgments irrelevant. The past no longer demanded resolution. Inside the house, nights grew calmer. He slept deeply, without the anxious half-wakefulness that once defined his rest. The forest sounds no longer triggered alertness. They blended into the background of safety he had built with his own hands. For the first time, rest did not feel borrowed. The final realization arrived not as a revelation, but as a steady awareness. He had not just built walls and a roof. He had built permission for himself to exist without apology. The house was a physical manifestation of that permission, solid and unarguable. On one quiet morning, light filled the interior through the windows he had installed months earlier. Dust moved gently in the air. Outside, the forest stood unchanged, indifferent to human stories. Inside, a man stood in silence, no longer proving anything. The people who once laughed would never fully understand what had happened there. They would see the structure and speak of materials, ingenuity, and endurance, but they would miss the deeper truth. That the most important thing built in that clearing was not the house. It was a life reclaimed from dismissal, constructed patiently from what others had thrown away, and finally made whole without a single word needing to be spoken. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories like this one. Watch the following videos and discover what happened next and what others never expected. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. You never know who it might inspire.